Hello, technomancers and tautologists. My name is TBSkyne. And so, League of Legends is finally getting that animated series, huh? To say that I'm excited would be an understatement, because not only does it feature some of my favorite characters and possibly my favorite setting of the game, its visuals are created by Studio Fortiche, whose skill and craft has been on display in every frame of every trailer of the show. Trailers can be misleading, of course. A studio will always want to put the good-looking stuff in the trailer and hide whatever corners they cut, but Fortiche has pretty impeccable pedigree, and I am pretty confident that this show is not only going to be gorgeous aesthetically, it is going to have absolutely beautiful character animation and a lot of great acting. Now, my colleagues Necrit and Tenebrix have each already put out a number of videos leading up to ARCANE that will get you up to date with what you need to know about the game's lore to follow the action. Necrit has a bunch of solid Easter egg compilations and speculations about the lore. Tenebrix has a guide to the characters and factions that are going to play a role, so I had to think about what I could contribute to get the fan base ready for the show. And what I landed on was a thematic introduction to the politics of League of Legends and the politics of its setting, because going by the trailers anyway, the politics of Piltover and Zaun are going to be at the heart of this story. From the apparent main villain Silco constantly giving monologues about power and wealth and revenge against the top side, to the mournful dialogue of Heimerdinger lamenting that the two cities were once one tribe now divided, to trailer footage showing protests and riot police. Well, between all of that, the class divide and wealth gap between Piltover and Zaun are at the very least going to be a source of tension in the plot and a motivator, a means by which the various characters in the plot go about enacting their stories. Piltover and Zaun, as a setting, is based on class struggle and class warfare. It interrogates the legacy of the Industrial Revolution and asks some pretty pointed questions about the cost of technological progress, perhaps especially relevant to a world currently being slowly cooked by the consequences of our own rapid industrialization. And while I'm not sure how much of this will be explicitly examined in ARCANE, I'm damn sure it's going to be relevant. Anyway, we're about 400 words into this video, which means that the people who get irrationally angry at the mention of the word politics in relation to pop culture have either already clicked a dislike and left, or they're in the comments writing long essays I won't read in response to things I haven't said. And that's fine. I can't reach everyone, and some people just don't really want to engage with art in this way. They have the right to that. And while I think every person should be able to engage with media on a political basis, that doesn't mean you have to do it for everything all the time. By all means, if you just want to enjoy the fantasy show as escapism and entertainment, don't let me stop you. I just think this way of thinking about media is more fun and interesting. And as a disclaimer, I'm an art critic, not a policy expert. I don't have a degree in political science. This is all amateur political analysis, so take me on that front with a grain of salt. Anyway, what are the politics of Piltover and Zaun, and how can we expect them to influence the story of ARCANE? What should you look out for, and what kinds of themes might be interesting to think about as you engage with the story? Let's get into it. Once upon the olden times in the League of Legends universe, meaning some 250 years ago or so in the timeline, there was a trading port on the isthmus of two continents. This port was Zaun, and it was controlled politically by large merchant clans with lofty aspirations for the city. They controlled the movement of goods overland from the sea in the west to the sea in the east, and it had made them fabulously wealthy. But that trade was also inefficient, and direct travel by ship between the two seas was impossible. So a grand project was envisioned. A canal was to be made between the two seas, and the merchants of Zaun would control and tax it and charge extravagant fees for passage for all the trading vessels of the world. You can see this as roughly analogous to projects like the Panama or Suez Canals, colonial projects designed to benefit the business interests of occupying powers, undertaken without the consent of the people whose land was used for those giant projects. In Zaun, this engineering project leads to disaster. The blasting and excavation goes horribly wrong, the lower parts of Zaun are fatally undermined, and the explosions trigger a series of cataclysmic earthquakes. Oceans rush into the caves and mines, collapsing industrial plants and spilling toxic chemicals in enormous amounts, creating huge saltwater chemical swamps. Thanks to the intervention of the wind goddess Janna, the damage is limited, but much of Zaun's population is displaced, and as they begin to rebuild, the wealthier among them naturally seek to get away from the chemically poisoned Undercity as much as possible. The merchant clans construct the enormous sun gates to regulate travel through the canal, and as the wealthier citizens build up and up and up, An extremely on-the-nose metaphor for capitalism begins to emerge, with the poor stuck in filth and misery and darkness in the lower city, which keeps the name of Zaun, while the rich, the powerful, the influential, and the privileged build a shining city of copper and brass in the sun up above, which in time comes to be called Piltover. The canal river through Zaun is called the Pilt, you see, so it's literally Pilt over the Pilt. You get it. In Piltover, the merchant clans that control the Sun Gates and run the politics begin to fancy themselves noble clans. And as noble clans are wont to do, they establish a pecking order and protocols and hereditary noble positions, passing their power down lines of succession, carefully managed with political marriages and alliances. The champion Camille is an enforcer of that hierarchy. Whenever, air quotes, low-born Zaunites who have managed to acquire wealth and power seek to make their way to Piltover, she is one of the agents of the establishment who will curb that rise. Usually by subterfuge and sabotage, sometimes by outright assassination, hence the knife legs. In one particular instance, a wealthy Zaun chemical merchant falls in love with a Piltover heiress, and Camille straight up murders the guy in front of his fiancée before the wedding can go ahead in order to preserve the balance of power in Piltover and keep the riffraff out. The wardens of Piltover, who are the police officers we see in the trailers, are an extension of this social control. Ostensibly, they are funded by taxes for the common good, but in reality political power and economic control over the wardens belongs to the noble clans, and it serves their interests. The streets of Piltover are well patrolled, but Zaun is largely left to rot. The citizens of Zaun that we see in the trailers have a hostile relationship with this police force, seeing them as servants of the topside nobles, and they are not wrong. Local power in Zaun, by contrast, rests not with hereditary noble clans, but a group of people referred to colloquially as the Chem Barons. These people are mobsters, gang leaders, and industrialists all rolled into one, and they control the internal politics of Zaun with private armies of enforcers battling each other for control and power in gang warfare. And where Piltover is run mostly on clean energy, or it outsources its energy needs to Zaun, the Chem Barons, as the name implies, typically make their wealth running enormous industrial plants, churning out chemicals and compounds and chemically powered technology to serve the industrial needs of Piltover and the merchant class. This industrial technology creates rampant and unregulated pollution, further poisoning the lower city and worsening the conditions in Zaun. The city often falls under what's called the Grey, which is basically smog on steroids. It is fog, mists, and noxious chemicals combining into enormous rolling clouds that blanket the undercity and slowly poison all who live there. Thus, the conflict between Piltover and Zaun is not a conflict between equals. One is a shining technological metropolis swimming in wealth and prestige. The other is a polluted industrial shantytown struggling with the consequences of all that technological glory. They are two houses divided, but not alike. One is clearly the exploiter, and the other is clearly the exploited. At least I think so, but if you ask Riot, well...
I think we were really interested in the two perspectives on the political situation between Piltover and Zaun. I think it's a good way to show that it's so easy to be very influenced by the perspective that you have and really lack an understanding of what it's actually like on the other side.
I think it was really important to us to show that there are merits and flaws to both sides.
Both sides? Huh. This is a familiar ethos for Riot, and indeed a familiar ethos in media. It's a very popular philosophy that a great story should be told with some level of dispassion, examining all sides and letting the audience come to their own conclusions. That last bit in particular is a popular buzz phrase. Most of AAA gaming is built on it, with game publishers often deliriously anxious to assure their audience that the story they're telling makes no moral judgments and definitely isn't preaching. Ubisoft does this a lot, saying that they don't want to tell the player what to think, as they slather incredibly charged political imagery across the front of all of their game boxes. We're just telling a great story in some cool locations, their PR people insist, as you join a secret government paramilitary unit and gun down insurrectionists in the streets of Washington, D.C. in the aftermath of a bioweapon terrorist attack. No politics here. In Riot's case, this dedication to centrism manifests in some interesting, albeit not necessarily unique ways. In Runeterra, radical political action is consistently portrayed as villainous. Take the story of Shurima, for example. It is a violently expansionist slave empire inflicting the most horrific suffering on millions of people in order to build the vainglorious edifices of its god emperors. But in the story of Shurima, the slave emperor who refused to end slavery until he was sure he could remain the absolute emperor of an intact state, that's Azir, is presented as flawed but ultimately redeemable, a good man who wants to do the right thing and struggles with himself to improve. By contrast, the born slave who saw his father brutally worked to death and spent his entire life protecting and advancing the goals of Azir, Zerath, is presented as a power-hungry, cruel, corrupt, and irredeemable person. The act of grasping for power that doesn't, air quotes, rightfully belong to him becomes a cataclysmical, magical disaster that devastates the Empire. It's a storyline where, yes, the institution of slavery is awful, but trying to overthrow the monarchy that benefits from slavery by violent means is shown to be dangerous, reckless, and ultimately a greater threat to freedom than slavery itself. It is shown to be preferable and rational to allow a slave emperor to keep his throne so he can end slavery the right way, whereas the moral sin of being too impatient to end slavery is shown to be violently corruptive, making you as bad or worse than the enslavers. Oh, the story is sympathetic to Zerath in that he's traumatized and responding to that trauma, but he's still a monster, and Azir is still redeemable. The integrity of the state, the continuity of the system, and the persistence of institutions is understood in this story as a natural and unquestionable good. The threat of a civil war that could tear the empire apart is understood as a worse moral hazard than slavery itself. It is understood to be preferable to allow the suffering of slavery to go on rather than risk the suffering of anarchy from trying to dismantle the system that perpetuates it. This is an approach to political storytelling that I think can be summed up as essentially trust the process. We see the same ethos applied to the story of Demacia and the Mage Rebellion. Demacia is a repressive, militarized feudal state led by hereditary nobility that maintains a well-funded secular inquisition called the Mage Seekers. Their job is to quite literally be witch hunters. These zealots are dedicated to hunting down magic and mages and exterminating it as a threat to the national security of Demacia. This persecution takes the form of genocide, and that's not me exaggerating for effect. Between the concentration camps, executions, suspensions of due process, violent removal of children, and attempts to wipe out magic as a culture and a physical trait in the population, the behavior of the Demacian state lines up pretty much perfectly with the UN definition of the term. Opposing the Demacian state on this point is Silas of Drekborn and his Mage Rebellion. Silas was taken from his parents as a child, used by the Mage Seekers as a living magic detector to identify, register, and often capture mages. And when he became involved in a tragic magical accident, the Demacian state imprisoned him in solitary confinement, which is a form of torture, for 15 years while slandering him as one of the worst and most dangerous magical criminals in the country. Silas, much like Zerath, is portrayed consistently as a callous, power-hungry, bloodthirsty, vengeful hypocrite who only cares about revenge. Where characters like Jarvan IV, who's currently presiding over the genocidal persecution of mages, or Garen, who's helping enforce this persecution, are portrayed as tragically misguided and driven by fear, and ultimately good men with good intentions who are redeemable. Silas, the violent radical who advocates for the destruction of the Demacian state for its crimes, is portrayed as a monster. Quite literally, he's introduced using visual references to Hannibal Lecter. Lux, the privileged child of a powerful noble house, is portrayed as the more reasonable counterpart to Silas the working-class kid because she cares about preserving the Demacian state and subscribes wholeheartedly to Demacian patriotism. In the story, it is made clear that if Silas had just chosen diplomacy, perhaps Jarvan would have listened to him. If he had just been patient and hadn't acted so violently and had tried to reach an understanding, why, the mage genocide might have ended already. The responsibility is laid on Silas for starting and agitating a civil war with his impatience and his unfit condition for leadership. The idea that the Demacian state did this to itself, that it is responsible for the conditions that lead to rebellion, is never really examined. The villain is Silas, the charismatic demagogue, whipping the mob into a fury. If not for him, peace and understanding might have been possible. Again, here, the preservation of institutions, the integrity of the state, these things are understood as inherently good. Demacia, the genocidal state that's doing genocide, is not portrayed as fundamentally evil, merely led by misguided people and corrupted by a few bad apples. Shurima, the slave empire founded on and perpetuated by slavery, is portrayed not as a violent, illegitimate empire, but as a lost golden age, which, yes, was marred by a few problems, but now that Azir is back and he's learned his lesson, and he's rebuilding the empire, well, so long as he stays humble and nice, then his return is good and the empire is cool and glorious and good for everyone. There are complexities to these stories beyond what I'm covering here. Of course, the point isn't so much to interrogate these storylines in detail, as it is to demonstrate that this particular ethos of what I would argue is neoliberal centrism or technocratic conservatism has a strong presence in the stories of League of Legends. Riot is willing to portray its power structures doing evil, but it rarely questions their fundamental legitimacy, and it has a habit of publishing stories that implicitly and explicitly condemn the concept of radical or violent political resistance to those power structures. Now, the attentive listener has probably caught on that I hold a different political perspective. I have extremely limited sympathy for Azir and Jarvan. I don't think they're bad characters, but I don't think they're good people. And I am perpetually disappointed that the only people articulating direct ideological opposition to the state are characterized as corrupt, insane villains rather than equal and legitimate opposition. But understand this. The point of this segment isn't that League of Legends must conform to my politics or else it is evil, and everyone who likes it is evil, and the writers at Riot are evil. This is not some call to cancel League of Legends. How would you even do that? Or a demand that it pander to me. Despite what some people in my comment section obstinately seem to believe, the point of criticism isn't to destroy or own or condemn those things which you dislike. It is to understand them. I happen to quite like League of Legends and its stories. I really like Runeterra. I really like the characters. I enjoy them, and I enjoy that League of Legends does attempt to reckon with some pretty serious political issues and storylines. That's why I bother to criticize. That's why I bother to try and understand the political and ethical perspective these stories are coming from. So what I'm giving you in this video is a political perspective on League of Legends and its stories. A political analysis. You don't have to agree with it. I just want you to try and understand it and use it as a jumping off point for your own criticism. So what does any of this have to do with ARCANE? Well, as we've covered, in the story of Piltover and Zaun, a central theme is one of social, political, and economic inequality. It's also about environmentalism, industrialization, and the impact of technological advancement, but the economic inequality is, in my view, the central idea being explored. Hence the steampunk quasi-Victorian Crystal Palace glories of the Empire aesthetic of Piltover. Hence the explicit industrial and punk aesthetic of Zaun. It calls back to classic imagery of class division. Piltover is the middle and upper class, and Zaun is the working class, and the tension between them is the tension of class warfare. Zaun suffers from economic deprivation and exploitation. Its labor builds the glorious city of Piltover, and it is then saddled with the pollution of that meteoric rise. In Zaun, children scavenge through chemical swamps for scraps that they can trade for food. Orphans live on the street at the mercy of gangs and chem barons, and die from the fatal poison smog that rolls through the lanes. These are political problems. They are material, economic, and systemic problems, and they are problems of justice. Piltover and Zaun are ruled by unelected merchant noble clans and might makes right robber barons. The police and justice systems are dominated by the upper classes, and the violence and deprivation of Zaun is seen by the ruling class of Piltover as a result of inferior culture and lowborn brutishness. So, when the Dev Diary developer interview teasing the series frames the conflict of the show as a matter of both sides and two perspectives, that there are merits and flaws to either side of the conflict, and when I know that Riot has a bit of a history for simping for the system, as it were, well, I get a bit worried. I get a bit worried that ARCANE is going to do what they have done before and cast the conflict between Piltover and Zaun as a conflict born not of a corrupt system, but a conflict between a few bad apples. Silco, Mel, the Chem Barons, and the Council. I worry that the show's takeaway is going to once again be that the system is good, that preserving the system and its institutions is inherently virtuous, while radical action to dismantle or reform it, or redistribute its resources, is understood as impatient, immature, corrupt, or a moral hazard greater than the suffering that it is seeking to remedy. As far as I understand the teasers we've seen so far, the conflict in the show is going to be spurred by Victor and Jace discovering Hex Tech technology, which gives Piltover an enormous new economic and political edge over Zaun. This, in turn, motivates Silco to whip up the mob, manipulate the people of Zaun to rise up so he can make a personal power grab because he's motivated by the same corruption, bloodthirst, and power hunger as Xerath and Silas before him. I worry that the only voices in the show actually calling for radical reform of the system are going to be the lying and disingenuous voices of demagogues and villains. I worry that the economic and class-based conflict between the cities is going to be framed as a problem of impatience and lack of mutual understanding, to be remedied with good feeling and togetherness rather than, material economic change. So why is that bad? Well, because to me that would be a waste of a good premise. Shurima wasted the opportunity to seriously interrogate imperialism, and Demacia wasted the opportunity to seriously interrogate cultural persecution when they both boiled down their conflicts to flawed ruler versus tragic villain. And again, I'm not saying that unless ARCANE tells a materialist story about why socialist revolution is the only way to save the world, it is a bad show for stupid people, or whatever. These stories are inherently deeply political, and Riot has been conducting itself in that apolitical AAA games sort of way, where they pretend to be dispassionate, that they're not making judgments or preaching or trying to tell the player what to think. We're just showing you both sides. Both sides have merits and flaws. We want you to make up your mind for yourself. What I'm saying is that is not true. I don't think it's a deliberate lie or anything, but Riot has politics. It is telling you what to think. It is preaching. It's not letting you make up your mind for yourself. It's presenting its stories through a particular lens, with a particular framework, and a particular ethical and political perspective. Riot's stories come from a position of what I, as an amateur, would analyze as neoliberal end-of-history centrism. They come from a perspective of technocratic conservatism, where the preservation of a system, a nation, a state, or a power structure is almost invariably preferable to radical reform or overthrow. Where, so long as the right people are in charge, the system can resolve all problems and quell all disputes. Just as I have my biases, which I try to be fairly open about, Riot has its biases as well. And when you watch ARCANE, be on the lookout for them. Try and spot them, try and think about them. How does the story want you to think about this conflict, and do you agree with it? Is that the only way to think about these problems? And again, you really don't have to think like me. In fact, I'd recommend that you don't. I'm acutely aware of the limitations of my own perspectives. Just don't let the storytellers dictate the terms of your thinking. Think beyond them. Think outside of their perspective. Engage in criticism and figure out what you think. Well, I just had to go and bring up the P word, didn't I? Moderating the comments on this one should be fun, but I'm not complaining. I did this to myself. ARCANE is premiering soon, and I'm sure I'll have plenty more to say about it, but don't worry, it won't all be political polemic. Believe you me, I'm gonna enjoy talking about the art and animation as well. I don't really know how I'm gonna navigate copyright, but I want to find a way to just do like a long-ass animation breakdown. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, leave a like on it, I guess. Subscribe if you are so inclined, and try not to get into too many fights in the comments. Like, you can't debate someone or change their mind in a YouTube comment. It simply isn't possible. I have a Patreon, a merchandise store, and a tip jar. You can use any of them if you want to, and that's helpful to me. It helps me pay my rent and stuff. But if you're not in a position to be able to, or you just don't want to, you absolutely do not have to. I also have a Let's Play channel where, well, I play video games, that's what you do on a Let's Play channel, and I have a Shorts channel where if you're tired of me talking a lot in long videos, you can watch me attempt to still talk a lot, but in a much shorter video format. Thank you very much for watching. Remember to wear a mask where necessary, and wash your hands frequently. Get the flu shot if you can, both because having the flu sucks and you want to avoid it, but also because you don't want to be the person who gets the flu during an ongoing pandemic. And you especially don't want to be the person who gives the flu to someone else during an ongoing pandemic. That's kind of a dick move. Get the flu shot. It's just a nice thing to do. And when you're done with all of that, remember to act with solidarity towards those who are worse off than yourself.